Good morning, sunshines. So today we're going to talk a little bit about historical context and historical research. Not so much practical research as just knowing times and periods. But before we get into that, I want to spend just a moment talking about the different types of directors you're going to run into and the type of director that I hope to strive to be. But I can tell you at different times I have been one or more of these different types. Depending upon the situation you find yourself in. The first type of director is the director that I'm going to call them the dictator. There's somebody who have the answer for everything. They're fully prepared. And a lot of times you're going to find yourself, especially in situations like in maybe some community theaters where a lot of people haven't done a lot of work before in various areas. You may have a set designer who's never really designed sets before and is really a carpenter more than a set designer, or somebody who is really an electrician or knows something about computers more than their sound or lighting designer. But it really is a director who just has all the answers and just gives the answers to the different departments and tells them what they need for the show. They're very much, they have the whole show blocked and planned and figured out from day one. Again, as a designer, I find that when people ask me what to do when that situation arises, my answer has always been, if the check clears, I'm fine with that. If the director has all the answers figured out and all they need is a technical director or a scene painter and I'm the set designer and they're paying me a good amount of money, then great. It makes my job easy because they just tell me what to do. However, if I'm not getting paid a lot or if I'm volunteering, that may be a situation where I pass it along to somebody who might be a little bit younger, more inexperienced, and might just need the experience of working on a show. The type of designer I hope to be is what I'm going to call, in this video we're about to watch, called the negotiator. There's someone who is prepared, who has done their planning and has done their research and could, if need be, take over the reins and move more into the dictator role, but is open to suggestions. Is somebody who's willing to, instead of saying the dress is green, say the dress needs to be earth tones, which just allows for a lot more interpretation for the designers to have. So there's somebody who have a very strong idea of the direction they're headed, but don't necessarily spoon feed the details. There's someone who allows actors to have input in the blocking and the movement, but is prepared in case the actor hasn't got the idea or the references to fill in the rest of the blocking, that sort of thing. Again, it's not so much dictatorial as it is negotiating. You have an opinion that you are willing to open up for discussion, but again, it leans toward the dictator process. Next is what your video is going to call the creative artist. This is someone, I'm not saying they're not prepared, but they haven't made choices. They're unwilling for whatever reason to make choices. Now, this occasionally happens when something is especially abstract and you're really not sure, that it doesn't happen in reality, but you're not really sure what the physicalness of the show might be, at least in my experience. There are directors who just, even on realistic shows, will still hesitate to commit to a door being here or the color of the wall or any of that sort of thing because they want a lot more input. And of course, the problem with that in theatrical terms is there's this little thing called opening night. And certain people, the set painters, the carpenters, the master electricians, the seamstresses, have got to get their job done. And it's not something you can change overnight. Now again, in acting, you can alter acting performances at the drop of a hat. But hopefully, again, the different aspects of the play, again, I like to look at plays as directors more like chefs. And the play is your recipe, and you have your ingredients, which are your sets, your lights, your costumes, your actors, all those sort of things. And the recipe is the play. And as a chef, there are things you are going to do that are going to still make it into that dish. Whatever, if you make lasagna, it still is lasagna. But there are different chefs who come along and will alter slightly the ingredients or the preparation time, or just have different additives they might bring in, different aspects. And so really the problem with people who are creative artists is that even choosing the recipe they're going to make sometimes is daunting to them because they really want to keep the options open, which again, I think that's a good starting point. It is definitely a horrible ending point. Then the fourth type of director is what I'm gonna call a combatant. They just are, they don't necessarily have any ideas themselves. All they will do is mock your ideas. They will tell you how what you're doing is wrong as a designer. They'll tell you how as an actor you suck. They are combative. They, literally throw tennis balls at people. They are, abusive and verbally abusive to people. I always wonder what inspired them to become a director, but it's very frustrating to work with that type of director. Again, just a small sampling. Of course, there's as many styles of directing as there are directors, I'm sure, but those are four basic major categories of directors. Again, myself personally, I strive to fit into that negotiator category, but I can guarantee you, even the director who's, I'm sure Cody has experienced my wrath on days when I just became abusive.
Voy a la playa, había subido la marea.
At some point or another, because you just get frustrated with the lack of effort or the input that your artists that you're working with may have committed to the show at a certain point, let's just say. But here's a little video that'll go into it. Again, this is a little bit more tongue-in-cheek than a lot of the stuff that I'm showing you, but still it's a nice way to look at the way that directors work with the production team.
Cut. Bravo. Perfect. It was excellent. Exactly what this scene didn't need. What was that crap? Improv? Are you kidding me? Are you the writer? Did you write this script? No, you didn't. You're an actor. There's a script. Say the lines. Say the lines. Say them. It's not that hard. Quit improving. Brenda, you're fantastic. But Jake, you're really sucking. Jake. I don't even know what to say to you right now. Do you know what acting is? Go for it. Be it. Layer it. Have you ever heard of subtext? I appreciate a good crap. I really do. If you could get an Oscar for that crap right there, winner. But get off my set! Go, get out of here. Just get. You know what? I'll just do the role. Brenda, you're hot. Feel it.
All right, cut. Moving on. No, one take. It's all we need. No, you're great. What? This is the first time that you've ever acted? Anybody tell this is the first time they've acted? That was, you're great. You know what? Okay, the lines are kind of like guidelines. In a perfect world, if we could say all the lines on the script, we would. But hey, it's not perfect. Guys, it's loosey-goosey. We got 75% of the lines. That's good enough for me. Let's move on. Guys, you know, this scene is kind of like lunch. Lasagna was great. It's kind of like this scene. This scene is great. You guys are doing a great job. If we can just remember that wonderful lunch. You guys are doing great, though. Keep it up. Great. Yeah. No, chemistry, whatever. As long as you guys are on screen together. So hey, this is supposed to be a happy scene. If you gotta knock back a few, I'm sure Crafty can whip something up for you. No, we're gonna land it. We're gonna land on the moon if we have to. All right.
No, stop, cut. I need you to imagine that you're an antelope. Frolicking through, not a meadow, but the city. You're a fish out of water, but an antelope. Okay, cut. Take a deep breath. Breathe in all the good, out with the bad, and action. Cut. When she comes in for the kiss, take a beat. Childhood. Mother's baking some cookies. It's your favorite cookie. You take a bite. Use that. Oh, cut. I'm getting a lot of pink. We don't need that. We need a bit of fuchsia, a little bit of aqua, botanical garden purple, not pink. Okay, cut. I think what needs to happen here is just go up on grapes. No, not pitch. Not, oh, it's okay, mother, I'll just have some grapes. Up on grapes. Grapes. Up. Does anyone else understand what I mean by go up on grapes?
So we're just gonna jump right into this scene. John, you're gonna say your lines to Alicia. I think the motivation could be like, what's the last line in this scene? I think if you were just to say, hey, I'm gonna try and get to the last line of this scene, I think that's probably a pretty good motivation. All right, run with that. Keep acting. If you just keep saying the lines, there wasn't necessarily anything wrong with it. It just wasn't a lot right with it. So we're gonna try and get one there's a little bit more right than there is wrong. Specifics, I think, can maybe hold us up. So just try and find a middle ground. A middle ground between fast and quick. That way you don't get there too slow. I mean, if you think about it long enough, it does make sense. I just want a lot of stuff to be happening here. I think your character needs to be emoting. I think your character needs to be emoting. This is definitely emotional. Does that make sense? I think some magic is gonna happen. So let's just keep going, swinging in the dark, and we may come across something that we really like. Great job, guys. Great job.
Now, what we are going to talk about today is periods in history. Again, I'm going to give you 7 basic, broad periods in Western civilization. Again, you have to know and realize that this class is a Western bias. But again, the plays that we're going to tend to work with in America are from that lineage. They come from that Western bias. They come from the Greeks and the Romans through the Middle Ages. Again, for instance, in the 7th century AD, while Western Europe was going through the Middle Ages, Arabic countries were having a blossoming with the advent of Islam. So it wasn't necessarily the Dark Ages all over the world. In Mayan cultures, they were developing. In China, they were having a great time. The Tang Dynasty was doing very well, thank you very much, in the 7th century AD. But again, we're going to skew this through the Western civilization because, again, we got to focus a little bit on, in order to understand the periods we deal with. However, just realize that there are plenty of periods outside of the Western European tradition that you can set a play in or that you can research for a play. Now, before we get into the 7 periods that I'm going to discuss, let me just tell you there are 3 things about each period that you're going to find. You're going to find there's the interpretation from photographs, lately, obviously late in the century, from paintings, from cave drawings, from the various interpretations of how people understood the way that costumes, that sets, or architecture, all those elements were at the time. There's the way that you can have practical research from today, so you can actually have the thing, which shows you how it actually was. And then there's the way that we have interpreted it in modern times through the lens of history, yes? So again, one of the things I'm going to do in these various styles that you're going to have listed here, again, I've got over 25 different period styles. You're going to find like modern movie versions of that style. You're going to find drawings, paintings from the period, and then you might find some research that are actual pieces. Again, even though you have an actual piece, let's say you have a vest from the 17th century, you can look at how it was sewn and how it was made, but the fabric may have deteriorated over time. The color may have faded over time. So even though you actually have the practical thing, none of these, in other words, are 100% accurate, but you get a sense through the development of the various styles as to how things, at least the approach to the way people dress themselves, the way people adorn themselves, the way people, the streets they walked around in, that sort of thing. So the 7 periods, again, one of the first period, what I'm called prehistoric. This goes all the way back to the dinosaurs. You have anybody that fits in this category. I'm called Persia, I'm gonna call it Babylonia, I'm gonna call it the first 2/3 of the Egyptian Empire, all prehistoric. In other words, there's nobody who's been writing the history of those time periods, so we really are just looking at relics and trying to determine as best we can what, through legend, through fable, that sort of thing, but we don't have historical accounts of those time periods. Now, just as, first when we get to the current period that we find ourselves in, there's a very big difference between modern dress, for instance, in the 40s, which we were at war, the 50s, which I'm gonna say the A-line skirt was big in fashion. In the 60s, we went more mod. The 70s, we went more polyester, disco, that sort of thing. So you can see that even within the modern period, from decade to decade, if not year to year, we have very different stylistic elements. And so to lump all these things into one prehistoric category is in many ways does a disservice to the particulars. But again, it gives you, just to give us a category to lump everything into that is pretty much the same basic approach to, in other words, you're talking about Stone Age, you're talking about Bronze Age. These people had very limited tools, didn't really understand things like electricity. In other words, the wheel had just barely been invented, so machines weren't a big part of their lives, and nor part of the wars that they fought and that sort of thing. We're talking about bows and arrows, all that sort of stuff. Cool. The next major period, what I'm going to talk about today are the, first of all, here's a little video about the prehistoric era.
The story of writing, astronomy, and law. The story of civilization itself begins in one place. Not Egypt, not Greece, not Rome, but Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is an exceedingly fertile plain situated between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. For 5 millennia, this small strip of land situated in what is today Iraq, Kuwait, and Syria fostered innovations that would change the world forever. Inhabited for nearly 12,000 years, Mesopotamia's stable climate, rich soil, and steady supply of fresh water made it ideal for agriculture to develop and thrive. About 6,000 years ago, seemingly overnight, some of these agricultural settlements blossomed into some of the world's first cities. In the period between 4000 and 3100 BC, Mesopotamia was dotted with a constellation of competing city-states. At one point, they were unified under the Akkadian Empire and then broke apart, forming the empires of Assyria and Babylon. Despite near constant warfare, innovation and development thrived in ancient Mesopotamia. They built on a monumental scale, from palaces to ziggurats. Mammoth temples served as ritual locations to commune with the gods. They also developed advanced mathematics, including a base 60 system that created a 60-second minute, a 60-minute hour, and a 360-degree circular angle. The Babylonians used their sophisticated system of mathematics to map and study the sky. They divided one Earth year into 12 periods. Each was named after the most prominent constellations in the heavens, a tradition later adopted by the Greeks to create the zodiac. They also divided the week into 7 days, naming each after their 7 gods embodied by the 7 observable planets in the sky. But perhaps the most impactful innovation to come out of Mesopotamia is literacy. What began as simple pictures scrawled onto wet clay to keep track of goods and wealth developed into a sophisticated writing system by the year 3200 BC. This writing system would come to be called cuneiform in modern times and proved so flexible that, over the span of 3,000 years, it would be adapted for over a dozen different major languages and countless uses, including recording the law of the Babylonian king Hammurabi, which formed the basis of a standardized justice system. But Mesopotamia's success became its undoing. Babylon, in particular, proved too rich a state to resist outside envy. In 539 BC, the Persian king Cyrus conquered Babylon and sealed his control over the entirety of Mesopotamia. For centuries, this area became a territory of foreign empires. Eventually, Mesopotamia would fade, like its kings, into the mist of history, and its cities would sink beneath the sands of Iraq. But its ideas would prevail in literacy, law, math, astronomy, and the gift of civilization itself.
So you see, it covers a lot of ground. There's not just Mesopotamia is certainly the cradle of the society as we know it, the font of humanity. But again, there's a big argument that it may have been, instead of Mesopotamia, it may have come out of Africa somewhere. So nobody really knows because it's prehistoric. The next major period is what's called Greco-Roman. This again is where society centers upon the Mediterranean Sea. Started when Greece repelled the invasions of the Persians. And the nice thing about the Greeks is that they started writing things, let's call them histories, telling stories about wars and who won wars and who fought each other and why. They started writing plays. They started having dramas. They started, having societies that were linked together by more than just warring factions, because they liked the trade and commerce developed. The Romans continued this. One of the things we forget is that the Carthaginians were a warring people who lived in North Africa, and around the 3rd century BC, the Carthaginians fell to the Romans. And the Romans continued the Greek tradition of learning, of society, of plays, that sort of thing. And so that's why I put them all in one lump category. Even though there certainly are differences between the Greek dresses and the Roman dresses and Greek architecture and Roman architecture, you can sort of lump them all into the basic idea that there were rules that they were trying to follow, and there were you could see what they were trying to attempt to do. As they bettered the society in which they lived. Yes, they were finding ways to create cities, to create countries, to keep countries together, to strengthen bonds among one another. Yes. Then we get into the medieval period, again starting around the time of around 500 AD. You suddenly have the western half of the Roman Empire, especially, fall into disarray. Starting with the fall of Rome to the Hun. And this led to a period where instead of valuing learning and valuing plays, we devalued those sort of things. And society became a very feudal system. Here's a little information about what life was like in the medieval period.
The medieval period, or the Middle Ages, spans almost 1,000 years between 400 and 1300 AD. This was a time when major art movements took place. New art genres were created. Different artistic traditions were meshed, including styles from the Middle East and Africa. And notable artists created some stunning masterpieces that would inspire the early Renaissance. The medieval period encompassed 8 major artistic movements, which include Byzantine, Islamic, Viking, Carolingian, Celtic, Ottonian, Romanesque, and Gothic art. The Middle Ages were also a time when Christianity was flourishing across Europe, and this meant a rejection of older pagan ways of life. Roman Emperor Constantine gained many followers after his public proclamation that Christianity, a religion which had been heavily persecuted in its early years, would now be tolerated. Medieval art reflects the sweeping popularity of Christianity. The medieval era saw the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, which is one reason why Emperor Constantine moved the Roman capital from Rome to Byzantium, which we know as present-day Istanbul. Constantine's Byzantine Empire relied on the stability of the East while maintaining ample trade routes with the West. A new sect of Christianity, Catholicism, gained prominence in the West, but the artists of the region followed the lead of their Eastern Byzantine peers in terms of artistic style. One of the key points to remember about art of this age is that due to concerns about the Bible's prohibition of graven images, medieval artists avoided sculptures in the round, which could be viewed from all sides, such as Roman busts. Instead, artists tended towards one-dimensional and somewhat abstract art. During the decline of the Western Roman Empire, religious mosaics and frescoes made their appearances in medieval churches, cathedrals, and basilicas. Medieval art involved a fusion of Eastern and Western cultures, including Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. The earliest medieval art, dating from 500 to 800 AD, is best known for the tessellated or repeated patterns of Islam and the Vikings' bejeweled migratory art. Islamic art reflected Muslim ideas of heaven as a natural paradise and featured many floral patterns as well as repeated geometric forms and elegant calligraphy. The Vikings excelled in woodwork and metalwork featuring interlaced patterns and abstract depictions of animals. As they were a migratory people, most of their art was portable. The Vikings are known for their fibulae, or golden brooches, and one of the most famous of these is the Ostrogothic golden eagle fibula, an abstract eagle brooch with a circular center and a geometric arrangement of precious gems. During the Carolingian period, between the late 8th and early 10th centuries, Emperor Charlemagne sponsored the construction of many extravagant churches and monasteries. He also lavished churches with gifts of liturgical items for use in Christian services, such as chalices, incense censers, and crosses made of gold and silver covered with pearls and gems. Although elaborate metal art had been common in the past, Charlemagne deliberately challenged the Byzantine iconoclasts of the late 700s by encouraging depictions of the human form, which could be viewed as idols in the liturgical art of his time. Charlemagne was also responsible for spreading literacy among nobles throughout his reign. He stressed the importance of books and reading, which had been neglected for many years, and his views led to the development of the popular Carolingian minuscule script. Illuminated manuscripts, or elaborately illustrated books, with covers made of precious metals and covered with jewels, were popular with monks in medieval times. The best-known illuminated manuscripts come from Celtic artists who used many of the same designs found in their legacy of metalwork in the intricate knot-like paintings in their books. Wealthy families owned their own illuminated manuscripts, which were called the Book of Hours, and were used for their daily religious activities. As demand grew, artists were encouraged to show off their skills in creating these manuscripts, which were needed for universities and monasteries, as well as wealthy patrons. Geometric patterns from Coptic Egypt and the Anglo-Saxon fascination with animal art began influencing Celtic style in the 7th century. Some of the best examples of early Middle Age art that we have today are found in illuminated manuscripts. The Book of Durrow, the Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and the Ebbo Gospels are 4 of the best-known manuscripts. During the Ottonian period, named after King Otto the Great, and his son and grandson Otto II and III, the cultural revival that Charlemagne had spearheaded influenced new art that took on an increasingly Germanic style. By 1000 AD, Romanesque architecture had begun to gain followers in France and quickly spread all over Europe as cities and their monasteries gained more and more power and wealth. Romanesque architecture was characterized by semicircular Roman arches, thick stone walls, and separated spaces according to function. Cathedrals were bigger than ever before and were richly decorated with vibrant paintings and figurative sculptures. Relief work in these cathedrals tended to be bigger than ever before, and artists explored new ways to make them more and more imposing. Every church had impressive frescoes depicting religious scenes, and this became almost mandatory for churches and cathedrals of the day. Many paintings featured horrible monsters and beasts battling it out with heroes, or amongst themselves. By the early 12th century, Gothic art had emerged in France. Gothic art was more realistic than previous medieval styles, and it also incorporated striking and elegant new designs into traditional art, which made this new style distinctive and popular. One of the key changes was in architecture, where it brought the integration of sculpture into buildings, like saint-shaped pillars and angels floating on window frames. The new design that Gothic architects adopted allowed them to free up space for stained glass windows. As a result, some spectacular stained glass work was created and installed in many churches. The most common themes depicted the Virgin Mary and Christ Child motif. As 1300 AD drew to a close, leading medieval artists like Giotto began searching for a way to set their work apart from the older Byzantine style. As a result of these artists' experimentations, the Renaissance style, which produced such masters as Michelangelo, Da Vinci, and Raphael, was born.
So again, even the medieval period can be sort of, there were the Dark Ages, and then there were the Middle Ages, so, but all of them fit into the medieval period. Then with the Renaissance, at the beginning of the Neoclassic era, you suddenly have a rebirth in learning. You suddenly have people rediscover the Roman and Greek ways. Of course, they don't get them 100% correct, but they're attempting to reestablish those type of laws about the way the world worked, that there was an order to society and an order to architecture, and there was an order to the way that people dressed and worked and communicated with one another. Then the next major move in the beginning of the 19th century, I'm going to call it Romanticism. Romanticism really starts with the idea that God is not all powerful. Beginning in the middle of the 18th century, I'm going to say. The idea that you had kings and queens who were in charge because God ordained it started losing favor. And so the idea that man could have an impact or was more important than God in many ways. And this all started, again, going back, I would say, as far as the 17th century, maybe with Galileo Galilei. Suddenly, the Earth is no longer the center of the universe. The sun becomes the center of our universe. And suddenly, we start questioning the relevance of God to our lives. Again, it begins as a little drop in the ocean, but by the beginning of the 19th century with Romanticism, that notion comes full bore. And suddenly, the notion that we are that humanity has power, that we are godlike, becomes a very romantic notion. And suddenly you can look at a creation like an urn and look at it and treasure it just for the incredible nature of it, and spend 24 pages discussing it in poetry. So that becomes the next phase, the Romantic phase. Again, here's a little bit about Romanticism.
Romanticism is one of the most important historical events of all time. Unlike a lot of what gets called history, Romanticism isn't a war or a piece of technology or a political event. It refers to the birth of a new set of ideas. It's about a mindset and a way of feeling. Romanticism began in Western Europe in the mid-18th century in the work of artists, poets and philosophers, and it subsequently spread all over the world, changing how millions of people look at nature, children, love, sex, money and work. We are all now, more or less, in some aspects of our sensibilities, romantics. Romanticism is best understood as a reaction to the birth of the modern world and some of its key features: industrialization, urbanization, secularization, and consumerism. What follows are some of the central moments in the history of Romanticism. The Marais, Paris, May 1762. The Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau publishes a book about the raising of children, Émile, or On Education. It contains diatribes against the oppressive world of adults and praises the natural goodness, spontaneity, and wisdom of little children. It is at points extremely anxious to get mothers to breastfeed their offspring, the first sustained argument for this practice in Western civilization. The world around Rousseau is growing ever more rational, scientific, and technologically based. It's increasingly sensible, planned, sterile, and bureaucratic. Against all of this, Rousseau emphasizes the child, the original rebel, the representative of everything that's pure, unschooled, and outside of adult discipline. It's the seat of creativity and genius. For the first time in Western history, glamour is directed not at the attainment of reason and adult self-control, but at the freedom from tradition and the natural innocence and sweetness of the child. Brook Street, London, August 1770. A precocious 17-year-old poet called Thomas Chatterton downs some arsenic and ends his life in a tiny attic apartment. He kills himself because no one wants to publish his poetry, which is concerned with beauty and wisdom, and because his uncomprehending family are applying pressure for him to become a lawyer. A cult soon grows up around the young, beautiful poet with shoulder-length chestnut hair. He becomes an emblem of something that will become very important for Romantics, the idea of the sensitive, doomed person, often an artist, rejected by a cruel, vulgar world. Chatterton stands at the head of a long line of Romantic heroes that will stretch from Byron to Keats to Van Gogh and eventually all the way to Jim Morrison and Amy Winehouse. Romanticism borrows from Christianity. The Romantic hero is a secularized, Christ-like figure, the loser who is in truth deeply noble in the eyes of the few who understand. Leipzig, Germany, 1774. The German author Goethe publishes the quintessential Romantic love story, The Sorrows of Young Werther. It tells the story of a passionate, doomed love affair between a young poet called Werther and a beautiful, clever young woman called Charlotte. Unfortunately for Werther, Charlotte is married, so the love is impossible from the very start. But that doesn't stop Werther, a dreamy and practical young man who loves the arts above all else. Like Chatterton, Werther is under pressure to have a sensible career and join bourgeois life, but he can think of only one thing: the impulses of his heart. Eventually, Werther can't take it anymore and kills himself. But rather than condemning him as a lunatic and a hothead, Goethe, one of the founding fathers of Romanticism, directs all our sympathies towards Werther. We're supposed to be on his side, admiring his passionate and entirely impractical attitude to love. The book becomes the most popular novel of a generation. 3 million copies are printed. Napoleon declares it the greatest work of European literature, and it dramatically changes how many people think of love, privileging dramatic outpourings of feeling over more traditional, rational concerns for class, lineage, and money. For a Romantic, it's always right and noble to follow your heart. The disastrous results that follow aren't any argument. They're just proof of how desiccated and heartless the so-called adult, sensible world can be. Madrid, Spain, 1798. The artist Francisco Goya produces one of his most iconic images, titled The Sleep of Reason Brings Out Monsters. It captures a quintessential romantic interest in the limits of reason and the power of the irrational over humans' fragile minds. To be romantic is to have sympathy for madness and to hold an almost vengeful attitude towards bombastic claims as to the triumph of rationality, science, and logic. The Lake District, England, December 1799. A young English poet called William Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy move into what's set to become one of the most famous residences in the history of English literature, Dove Cottage in Grasmere on the edge of the Lake District. Here they will spend the next 9 years, and Wordsworth will write some of the greatest poetry in the English language, celebrating something that's very under threat, the natural world. He'll write about daffodils, oak trees, clouds, butterflies and rivers, and his work will charm and seduce Europe. Within a generation there will, in Wordsworth's own estimation, be more tourists than sheep in the Lake District. Most importantly, running through Wordsworth's poetry is an abiding hatred for everything mechanical and industrial. When many years later a railway line threatens to pass through the Lake District, Wordsworth and his followers do everything they can to have the train, a symbol of Wordsworth's hated technology, rerouted. To be a romantic is to take the side of nature against industry. It's to prefer a daffodil to a viaduct, a tree to a factory. At the moment when huge swathes of Britain are being covered in the often monstrous new cities that are making Europe rich, Wordsworth, the quintessential romantic, speaks up for the natural and the simple life. Niagara, United States, September 1829. The American painter Thomas Cole paints one of his most characteristic images of the mighty Niagara Falls with a couple of Native Americans in the foreground. Cole makes his name as a painter of sublime scenes, vast landscapes of the American interior, showing nature at its most dignified and impressive. Man looks lost and puny by comparison. This too is a typical romantic attitude, for romantics don't believe in God, but they go in search of the emotions one might once have had around religion, and locate them in the big, wide-open spaces of nature. To be a romantic is to find relief from the pressures of competitive city life in the sort of natural grandeur that transcends all human achievements and concerns. Westminster, London, April 1847. 14 years after some fairly incompetent officials destroy the British Parliament with fire, a new building reopens designed by a rising star architect, Augustus Pugin. Oddly, even though the building is new, it's made to look old, very, very old, medieval in fact. It's full of suits of armour and seated angels. When the architect Pugin defends the building, he argues that his building is noble because it harks back to his country's pre-industrial past, before it grew obsessed, he's careful to add, with money or technology. It begins a cult of the Middle Ages, a big theme in Romanticism, which identifies in the world of knights and castles a nobility that is thought missing from the factories and shopping arcades of the modern world. Saint-Germain, Paris, May 1863. The French poet Charles Baudelaire writes a prose poem celebrating an unusual character whom he calls a flâneur, a stroller or loafer. A casual wanderer who has no particular job to go to and just spends his time observing busy street life of a modern city, threading his way through the crowds, strolling instead of rushing, sampling people's conversations and creating narratives for others' lives. Baudelaire, a typical romantic, admires the flaneur's playfulness and lack of practicality. This person isn't a waste of time. It doesn't matter that he doesn't have a job. For Baudelaire, he is a prince, unlike the boring wage slaves rushing to the new offices of capitalism. Le Havre, April 1891. The French painter Paul Gauguin set sail for Tahiti, hoping to escape everything that is artificial and conventional. He lives in the Pacific South Seas on and off for the rest of his life, drawing young native women looking relaxed and natural without anything on. They are, in his eyes, evidence that civilization is what has made us sick, a core romantic belief. The Romantic movement has permanently changed our sensibilities. As the world has grown ever more technological and rational, Romanticism has come to stick up for the irrational, the untrained, the exotic, the childlike and the naive. There is naturally something a bit adolescent and immature within Romanticism, but then again, there can be something rather heartless, cold, dogmatic and arrogant in many aspects of modernity. One hopes this isn't going to be the end of the story, that we may in the future learn to soften the worst sides of modernity through the best sides of Romanticism, in order to create a more evolved alternative, what one might term an age of maturity.
Excellent. One of the problems with Romanticism, of course, is that if you're just looking at the wonders of the universe, you're not really addressing the problems that are inherent in society, like slavery, for instance, like poverty, like ignorance. Those sort of things are sort of the underbelly of society. And the problem with Romanticism, if everything's wonderful and the world is a loving, caring space and nature's all beautiful and God is beautiful, suddenly you sort of get the sense that you're not really addressing any problems. And really, Romanticism of all these periods, I'm going to say, is the shortest lived of them, simply because you sort of get sort of the cake at the end of the dinner. And when you find out when all you eat is cake, you really hunger for a little bit more meat in your diet, or at least something more substantial, for those of you who are vegans. And so you turn to the next phase is modernism. Modernism again starts with Ibsen, he's the father of modern realism. But modernism really is trying to figure out how to better society and to make plays have an impotent, or art in general, have an influence on making society better. How can we better organize society? Again, socialism, not socialism, but have society become the focus of research, trying to figure out better ways of coordinating governments, of having systems work, sanitation, all the way up to transportation, all the way up to just education. How do we teach and train? And again, you're having more and more rapid forms of connection between trains, planes, automobiles, all those things are coming along, and society becomes a much more unified space over the course of this period, where you're having to deal with people who don't necessarily have the same religious beliefs, backgrounds, all that sort of stuff. And so that is the advent and the cause and the nurturing of modernism. It is a way of of incorporating everyone, of having systems that work, having systems that support everyone who is involved, not just the elite. Yes. The last major section in this, the seventh section, is what I'm called postmodernism. Postmodernism, I would say, begins sort of mid 20th century. I would say it's the result of a lot of wars, people questioning the validity, even the existence of God. Dadaists are certainly a part of this postmodern movement. Postmodern movement is more art for art's sake. It is randomness. It is non-structured society. Well, here's a little video talking about postmodernism.
Modernism versus postmodernism. This lecture offers a basic understanding of the difference between modernism and postmodernism. I'm D. Elizabeth Glasgow, and I'm your lecturer for this series. The 20th century can be divided into two distinct periods, one characterized by the modernist movement and the other by postmodernism. Postmodernism was a response in many ways to modernism, and hence they can be considered to be two aspects of the same movement. But there are major differences between modernism and postmodernism. Modernism's segue into postmodernism came about because of a basic difference in the way of looking at society and progress. That is to say, the difference lies in two approaches towards life. First, some background. Modernism and postmodernism is a reaction to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a period in European history during the 17th century when science and reason supposedly triumphed over faith and tradition as a societal guiding principle of progress. The reality was more complex, and it is this complexity that fueled the inception of both movements. Two central tenets of the Enlightenment were as follows: 1. The perfectibility of human nature, and 2. The belief in human progress through the development of human knowledge, especially the sciences. The Enlightenment is often considered by many historians, but not all, to be the beginning of the modern period in human history. By the 19th century, the Enlightenment's impact was assessed by intellectuals and artists, and it was reaffirmed. But some of the ideals of the Enlightenment, like certainty, were jettisoned. In the 20th century, scientific findings like quantum physics seriously undermined the possibility of a deterministic model of the world. As a guiding principle, reason was still affirmed, as was the belief in human progress. Technology encroached into all aspects of life and was seen as evidence of the capacity of calculated reason to improve human life. The project of modernism was to examine the impediments still holding society back. For example, in the visual arts, there was the rejection of realism as an artistic ideal and the move toward more abstraction and self-conscious art. This can be seen with the artistic output of painters like Theodor van Gogh and his intense landscapes, or Picasso and his cubist portraits. These works express deep perceptual truths without being true to observed reality. Similarly, modernism in music referred to a period of change and development when composers made a break from past conventions in music by experimenting with altering, organizing, and approaching harmonic, melodic, and rhythmic aspects of music. The modernist composers challenged orthodox conventionality in the music field by experimenting with composition. As with music and art, in architecture and literature, this experimentation and other unorthodox approaches across the creative genres generated hostile criticism from the public. During the modernist era, art and literary works were considered unique creations of artists. These works were believed to possess deep meaning. It was an era dominated by novels and books. During the postmodernist era, with the onset of microchips, digitization, and other technological advancements, television and computers became dominant in society. Art and literary works began to be copied and preserved by means of digital media. Individuals ceased to believe that art and literary works bore one unique meaning. Rather, postmodernists believed in deriving their own meanings from works of art and literature. Interactive media and the internet led to distribution of knowledge. music by people like Mozart and Beethoven, which was appreciated during modernism, became less popular in the postmodern era. World music, DJs, and remixes characterized postmodernism. Architectural forms that were popular during modernism were replaced by a postmodern mix of different architectural styles. Modernism overview. Modernism describes a collection of cultural movements of the late 19th and early 20th century. It was an emancipatory project whose main idea was that traditional values and institutions were oppressive, divisive, and inefficient and should therefore be replaced by rational values and institutions. Modernism was characterized by a dramatic change of thought, whereby individuals used intellect to improve the human environment. Modernism brought about a reform in all spheres of life, including philosophy, commerce, art, and literature, with the aid of science, technology, and experimentation. This led to progress in many spheres of life by changing the approach of mankind towards them. Ultimately, modernism attempted to free humanity from its historical baggage through the use of philosophy and science. For instance, liberalism and socialism, communism, are prominent forms of modernist politics. In architecture, art, and music, modernists tried to produce timeless products that were not tied to tradition, but instead relied on formal mathematical rule sets. The music of Schoenberg, the Baja School of Architecture, and painters such as L. Lissitzky are typical examples for modernist art. Now, postmodernism. Postmodernism means after the modern. It was a reaction to modernism and was influenced by disenchantment brought on by the Second World War. Postmodernism refers to the state that lacks a central hierarchy and one that is complex, ambiguous, and diverse. For example, developments in society, economy, and culture of the 1960s were impacted by postmodernism. Postmodernism can be thought of as a nihilistic response to modernism, which was a positive and constructive ideology. Postmodernists ascribe to the notion that modernist ideals can never be attained because of differences among cultures and human beings in general. In other words, postmodernists like Heidegger, Derrida, and Lyotard attacked the modernist belief in rationality, objectivity, and universalism in favor of relativism, the view that there is no objective truth, as well as identity. Grand narratives like freedom, societal progress, scientific progress were criticized by postmodernists who instead emphasized that difference rather than forced unity should be celebrated. Again, this way of thinking came about because of some setbacks in the modernist agenda, like World War I, World War II, colonialism, and the failure of both liberal capitalism and Stalinism to deliver what had been promised by modernity, mainly wealth and freedom. In other words, postmodernism is a backlash against modernity. The two world wars were a major setback to culture in general. They were a shock. Postmodernists believed that the monstrosity of the wars was enabled by modernism, which they saw as the brainchild of the Enlightenment, calculated reason, and technology. This belief dissipated faith in human progress and the perfectibility of human nature. The collapse of tradition created a frightening situation, whereby meaning became difficult to discern amid the horror of societal breakdown. After the wars, a return to the modernist project, tradition was no longer a viable option. This led to serious questioning of humankind's place in the universe. Postmodernism, hence, represented a loss in faith in human reason. Postmodernism provides a bleak prognosis of the human condition and offers no real solutions. Conclusion. Modernism and postmodernism were both movements that emerged from an analysis of events within the modern period from the perspective of the values of the Enlightenment. But, whereas modernism offered a qualified endorsement of Enlightenment ideals, postmodernism was an unequivocal denunciation of them. Modernism developed into an ideology of a unified world and a unified humanity with a shared vision and shared goals. Postmodernism, on the other hand, was a counter-movement to modernism. Postmodernists argued that humankind may never reach its goal of a unified humanity.
Again, so those 7 large, very large categories are just a way of sort of organizing the various forms throughout that time period into their relevance into society and how they sort of relate to one another. Yes, again, I've given you about 30 pages here or so of different styles that you can look to. I'm expanding it all the time. You may have different styles that you would like to include or incorporate. From the Vikings to the Arabs to Star Wars or Star Trek, all those things. They're all different approaches towards costuming and towards scenery that as a director you can look for and to try and interpret your plays. Yes, you may find there are aspects of that society which help to bring out the ideas that are in your plays. Cool. All right, enjoy.